we could
Oh,
also
yeah,
talk
makes
about
sense.
the workshop.
Awesome, sure.
Cool, thank you. But okay, so it's just after 2:30, so I'd like to invite the next speaker up. His name is Dean Schuster. So Dean is the owner and partner of his own firm as well, called True Matter. Dean is based in New York City, so we've gone from Georgia to New York City, and Dean's talk is about how the Soviet space program has taught him how to be a product designer. So we're going across the globe, and a little bit more about Dean. His most impactful class that he took at school was chemistry, very interestingly, when he was 16. And if money was no issue, what he would be doing right now is setting up the first human colony on Mars. I think there's still scope for you to do that, Dean, but let's first start with the space program. So over to you and your talk, please.
All right. Well, I've got to get over to the podium here, right? So there we go. There I am. Okay, now I'm going to try to share my screen. We're going to see how this goes. All right, yay. Now, I think you all can see me. You can see my screen. I'm going to try to go ahead and go into presentation mode. Let me just get some confirmation that you can see my big screen here, DXZA21. Is that correct? Can you all see it? Because I can no longer see the screen.
Yes, we can see it perfectly. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, great. So thanks so much for having me. I'm Experienced Dean on Twitter. I am owner of a company called True Matter, and we do only UX all the time. And today, yes, we're going to talk about what the Soviet space program taught me about digital product development. We're really going to talk about this. And I love that I'm following Jay because we're so already attuned to the past. And here, instead of talking about my own background or my ancestors, we're going just into history itself and what history can teach us about designing digital products. And it really can. So we're going to go back a little bit in time to the year 1968. And in this image, you see some scientists with two little tortoises. And in September, these two-step tortoises were the first Earthlings, 1968, to fly around the moon and back. The mission was another first for the Soviet space program, and they were used to being first at like everything. And the spacecraft that they used to send these tortoises up was known as the Zond 5, and here it is, the Zond 5. And it flew around the moon as planned, but on re-entry to Earth, instead of landing in Kazakhstan, it landed in the Indian Ocean. And it was close enough to an American vessel, the CIA was tracking it, to photograph this thing before the Soviets could pick it up. And this is the actual capsule. And this is what was photographed. And when the Americans saw this, they were very excited because it confirmed for them what they already suspected, that Soviet technology was very, very far behind American technology in 1968. The Soviets were no threat to beat us Americans to the moon. 3 months later, Apollo 8 circled the moon, not with tortoises, but with people. And the USSR abandoned all hope to even try to beat us to the moon. And I swear this story totally reminds me of digital product development. I'm not kidding, because the Soviet space program didn't meet expectations, and the Zond 5 didn't meet expectations. And honestly, we see that a lot with digital products. They fail to reach expectations, they fail to reach their goals, they crash and burn. And it started me thinking about all the similarities between the Soviet space program and what I'm doing every day and what many of us are doing every day. So digital product development and the old Soviet space program, mid-century, it's all about high-tech engineering, but it does have a design side to it. It's multidisciplinary. Both of these fields sort of burst into the mainstream out of nowhere. I mean, the internet itself is something that we have based on the space race. And both activities, making digital products or trying to get someone out into space, are activities of making. We're making things, we're inventing things, but they're set in a bigger context. You know, the space race and politics and digital products and corporate need or organizational need. So the question I started asking myself was, what is it that went wrong with the USSR? What can we learn from the space program, their space program, that didn't quite go the way they wanted to? And how can that help us make sites, apps, and software? It totally can. So first thing we're going to do really quick is take a little bit of a primer on the space race. I know many of you listening are young folks, and really the space race predates me, but it's just a long time ago now. So here's a brief history. Now, after World War II is over, the Soviet Union captures a bunch of scientists in Germany, and they get their hands on German rocket technology, including this V2 rocket. So that means they have all this great rocket technology, and they see the potential for rockets in warfare. Now, in terms of nuclear weapons, right, which were already used by the United States, the Soviet Union develops nuclear weapons, and they start putting them on the top of these rockets, and they're creating ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, right, that can go very, very far and deliver this nuclear warhead. Now, this is modern brute strength, right, from the Soviet Union. And it's sort of different from the way the United States did it with planes and submarines, things like that. But it led to this thing called the Cold War. This is an existential competition. The Soviets had tons of nuclear weapons by now. So did the United States by the mid-50s. And they have enough to destroy the other side completely. Now, that's the notion of MAD, mutual assured destruction, right? The two powers, they're arguing over basically the entire planet. And they wanted to avoid all-out destructive conflict. So they settled into conflict by other means: political, athletic, territorial, scientific, and of course, space, right? So the Soviet Union saw the potential for rockets going into space, and they exploited rockets to the full. They were ahead in rocket technology, and they wanted to use this to create a space program. And now we have a space race. Everyone's trying to get into space first. The Soviet Union is trying to get it there. The United States is trying to get there. They don't want the other side to be the first to exploit space for military purposes. And then we have this parallel to the arms race in space. Now, in the Cold War, propaganda was everything. If you could just show that you were superior to the other side, that the showing of that superiority became an end unto itself. Now, the Soviet Union, they were already built upon this huge propaganda apparatus, and they developed a propaganda machine around space so that they could tout their achievements. They were going to be first, right? Very true for space, which had caught the imagination of the world. I mean, we're headed for the moon. Nothing less than putting a human being on the moon was going to be the goal for the space race. It's sort of a winner-take-all prize of the space race in the Cold War. And in 1957, the Soviets basically strike first in the space race, and they launch Sputnik 1. And it goes up into space. And at the time, having a satellite up in the sky was a weird new thing, and it was scary from the American perspective. Here we are sitting in America, and there's a Soviet satellite going above us. Oh no, they're going to militarize space and we're left behind. So Sputnik was a big, big, big deal. But it wasn't the only first for the Soviet Union. They got used to a lot of firsts in space. First crewed space flight, first animals to orbit the Earth, first person in space, first orbit of the Earth, first flyby of the moon, first picture of the dark side of the moon, first flyby of another planet, first woman in space, first spacewalk, first landing on another world, Venus. All these firsts occurred just before the Americans were capable of attempting them or trying them. Sometimes the Americans were sort of just behind. And the Soviet propaganda machine took every advantage of it. They were gunning to be first. Now, we all know the history. The United States did catch up. Spurred on by John F. Kennedy's speech in 1962, the United States developed a substantial space program of its own, has to catch up with rocket technology, fall behind very early, but slowly but surely come back. And ultimately, the methods of NASA in the United States proved decisive. By 1968, with Zond 5, it was over, basically, already. And in 1969, we all know what happened. You know, one of the greatest things in the history of human achievement was people got to the moon. And it was an American flag, not a Soviet flag, there. So my question is, what can we learn from the Soviets? What can we figure out about this sort of failure? They were first in everything, yet didn't make the final goal before the Americans. But what happened? What happened? So I'm going to share a few examples in my talk today. And we're going to look at a lot of beautiful art from Soviet space propaganda as we go. Now, the first thing to think about when you think about the Soviets and about how we develop digital products is this notion of something that's done very quickly, that's minimum viable and put out there. It's the need for speed. We see this all the time in the work we do, and it was certainly true of the Soviets. They were seriously focused on being first, and they threw everything into the effort. They bulldogged it. They bootstrapped it. They worked under such heavy time pressure. They weren't testing things. They were throwing stuff up there without fear or worry. It relentlessly drove everything they did. Quality was not the primary concern for their launches or their successes. So that brings us to the first spacewalk, right? This is a huge first in human history. This is 1965. This is Alexei Leonov. He's outside, is a real picture. He's outside the Voskhod 2, and he performs humanity's first spacewalk. And man, the Soviets wanted to get this one. They wanted to be first, and they were. And they had this old rocket called the Voskhod 1, and in order to get the spacewalk done, they just rejiggered it, and they reinvented the Voskhod 1 and made the Voskhod 2 just to do the spacewalk. But that meant they had to change this rocket in ways that weren't exactly wise. Right? They removed things like ejection seats. They made it so the crew module could never open into space because they were still using vacuum tube technology in this thing. So they had to put in an airlock and made it an inflatable airlock out in space. There was no provision for crew escape at launch or landing. The descent module was the same as the landing module. There's no difference there. It's a big deal in space. And Leonov himself used a spacesuit that's experimental and was never tested. They just wanted to get up there fast. It was very, very reckless. Specifically, that inflatable airlock. I mean, that was put together fast and was not safe and was really not tested. All right? So when Leonov goes out into space, he's out there for 12 minutes, and there's a problem because he has to get back before they go to the dark side of the Earth. And his spacesuit was malfunctioning, and it grew huge in the atmosphere. And when he tried to get back into the Voskhod 2, he couldn't fit anymore. So he did something crazy, or else he was going to die. he bled oxygen from his suit, which, by the way, gave him decompression sickness. And he had to get back into the Voskhod 2 by turning around. He went in backwards. He had to turn around in that thing, get in. He perspired and sweat so much, he filled his boots with sweat. And his heart rate was so high that they thought he was just going to have a heart attack. Anyway, he does actually get in the spacecraft. And then on the way back, the spacecraft malfunctions, has an emergency crash landing in the mountains, and he and his fellow astronaut have to be out in sub-zero temperatures for 2 days waiting for rescue. That first happened for the Soviets, but it did come at a price. It's basically a miracle that Alexei Leonov survived this at all. It's crazy. At any given point, this dude could have died outright. In fact, I would say it's a very shocking story. You should totally Google it for more. It's amazing. But further Voskhod missions were immediately canceled. They were deemed too risky and dangerous. For the Soviets, that is saying something. And the comparison is real, because before you consider it unfair to compare digital product design to this problem or the Soviet space program, consider the track record of software. As amazing and life-changing as software has been, our industry isn't exactly known for rigorous, error-free products, is it? I mean, today, we're decades into the information revolution. The web has been around since the early 90s, and digital products of all kinds, they still ship with swarms of bugs, massive user experience flaws, and somehow, some way, we've just grown to expect it. We're totally okay with it. We're so okay with it that we gave it a name, MVP, minimum viable product. And today in software development, MVP rules the day. And to be fair to MVP, there's considerable good here. Okay, MVP came about as a reaction to an industry-wide epidemic of software creation, of overwrought solutions, expansive processes, individualized resources, delay culture. So building in digestible chunks and teams incrementally with something you could launch, that's actually a really good idea. There's nothing wrong with that. MVP is like evolution at work. The problem is we've sacrificed a whole lot, too, to get there. Certainly, just like the Soviets had to sacrifice. The pendulum goes both ways. I mean, we have so much faith in this new model that we're not asking core questions anymore about quality, or at least we rarely do in my experience. We've got speed, we've got time to market, but we're missing other things. I mean, digital products, last time I looked, they're still shipping with massive errors. They still have quality problems. They still have rampant user experience problems. Anyone using their folding phone these days? No, not yet. No, came out a little too early maybe. We're back exactly where we started. We just changed the way we got there. See, MVP was supposed to be this way that we would work on products and then continually refine them after launch, right? Get something out minimal first. But honestly, in my experience, that's not really happening. What happens is teams throw out an MVP as fast as they can, sacrifice quality, sacrifice user experience, move on to the next MVP. That's what happens all the time. So we've got to do better. Yeah, we've got to ship. But we got to focus on quality. And that means focusing on things like, just fixing bugs, but also on things like user experience, right? So we can hit the promise of the adaptability of MVP. We're going to have to do better. And that's going to mean differences in our organizations, getting user experience teams, content strategy teams, changing processes, thinking about quality, maybe just waiting a little bit longer, just a little, to get something great. Which brings us to Gemini 4. 3 months, just 3 months after this near disaster of Voskhod 2, the Americans send up Gemini 4. The Gemini technology in their rocket was superior in every single way to the Voskhod. It was very, very, very safe by comparison. And this is a picture of Ed White. He's the first American to walk in space. He spent 20 minutes outside of the spacecraft. He's loving it. He's filming it. He doesn't even want to come back in. He has to be ordered by mission control to come back into the capsule. He reluctantly goes back to the capsule, and on his way back in, he opens the door, because of course he could just open the door, and he looks around back into space and says, "This is the saddest moment of my life, going back into the capsule." Totally different story. Everything was safe. Everything went well. The Soviets were rushing. Americans were moving fast, but not crazy fast to sacrifice all that safety. 3 months is no big deal. No big deal. And a few years later, right, the space race is no longer even close. Okay, a couple more lessons. Something I call the Korolev effect, that one person alone can't save the day. Let's meet someone called the Integral, the chief designer of the Soviet space program. This dude is named Sergei Korolev. He was thrown in a gulag by Stalin. He was released because he knew rockets. And rockets meant space. And he's the guy who actually develops the Soviet space program. He has to convince Khrushchev to actually go for space, not just weapons. He was the man, okay? He led this program relentlessly. Nothing happened without Korolev dictating it. He was the guy. And it just proves that one person can change history. He planned, designed missions, processes, technology growth, all because of him. He was amazing. And remember, he was kind of alone because the Stalinist purge, basically murdered most of the scientists. He was lucky, and he survived because of his ability to work on rockets. But that results in a fundamental flaw for the Soviet space program, right? Because he dies in 1966. Now, the Soviet space program is already having trouble keeping up with the Americans. It was never the same again. Without Korolev, everything went into chaos. There was a power struggle, and people are desperately trying to be the person to lead it. The very first mission that goes up after Korolev dies, the Soyuz 1, it launched despite well over 200 documented design flaws noted by the engineers. It had serious failures, and it led to an ignominious first for the Soviet Union, the first in-flight fatality in space. When one man's pivotal, the program's flawed. All right, this feels familiar to me too, because our industry is just driven by talent. It's driven by people who are superstars or leaders. And, what happens when they leave a company or they're hit by lightning, or whatever? Basically, our teams are reliant on superstars. They have lots of domain knowledge. When that goes away, that's a problem. And maybe they're motivated or political players who could ruin projects all by themselves. So the lesson here is to not do things like Korolev did. Is to invest more in teams and more in systems. And honestly, I'm not seeing enough investment in broad-based teams and digital product development. It's still very early, and it's still mostly software-driven, and it's not holistic with people like UX professionals, content strategy professionals, and things like that. And that's what's needed. Now, another interesting thing that happened in the Soviet space race was, as I mentioned earlier, this notion of propaganda. Reality is what you make it. And the Soviets were particularly focused on proclaiming to the world that they were number one and they were first in the space race. America did it too. The Soviets were just over the top about it. And they had this newspaper, some of you remember, it's called Pravda. And Pravda was a newspaper. It was a political vehicle for the ruling party. And it means truth. And this was the masthead of their paper. So truth is sort of in the eye of the beholder, it seems, especially in terms of propaganda. Because remember that Zond 5 and the tortoises, that sort of crash landing in the Indian Ocean in 1968? Well, that was kind of something that didn't go very well. It was sort of a last gasp of the Soviet space program. But they produce posters for it, and they do propaganda for it. They do stamps, it's the Zahn 5 stamp. Notice they put it out in 1969. What else was happening in 1969? Oh, yeah, the Americans were on the moon. So propaganda still keeps going no matter what. And man, the Soviets were great at it. And they actually made some beautiful art in this period. They were very good at space propaganda. Just amazing stuff. Tons and tons of this stuff you can see online. They were very serious about it. And it meant everything to their national identity. And it was a bitter defeat to not get to the moon first after all of their particular firsts. I mean, this is wonderful art. And they used it to drive reality. Propaganda is about keeping everyone in line, motivating and manipulating a population to believe a certain thing, so they remain fully committed to your cause. It's sort of a form of control, right? And think about what it does. For the Soviets, truth was only tangentially related to what was really going on in the space program. Yeah, there were firsts, but there were massive problems. Propaganda is about artificial timelines, and this is certainly true in the space race. The Soviets were putting up timelines that were just based on anniversaries or what the U.S. was doing, not really based on technology or quality. The announcements were about reinforcing their power, not really about driving a program. It was basically largely political, not quality driven. Okay, yikes. That sounds like most digital products I've actually worked on in my career. Sad to say. Propaganda is not just something that happens from countries. It happens with companies. And they play this way, like product launches are timed to what competitors are doing, timed to trade shows, timed to artificial deadlines. Announcements are made to procure sales, to placate investors. We exaggerate claims with little incremental updates, but they're the best thing ever. We overpromise features without talking to project teams. This happens all the time. I feel like we are the Soviet system very much in that sense. And it's an uncomfortable comparison, right? Because we need to break free from that narrative if we want to create products of quality. And that's really tough to do. So let me wrap up with a couple of quick lessons for us. The main thing to understand as digital product developers and designers when we think about the space race is that we're really thinking about different philosophies of development, right? The Soviets are focused on being first, MVP, propaganda wins, driven by one dominant personality. Let me get my light there. There we go. I have a motion-controlled light in this office. Okay. Now, the philosophy for the United States was a little bit different, a little bit slower, a little bit safer, a little bit more focused on quality. And those different philosophies were driving the space race. And we know which one ultimately succeeded. So our job really is to learn from the past, learn from the Soviet program. That means investing in quality, particularly in UX, because that's so very lacking. Building something that outlives yourself, focusing on systems, focusing on things that are replicable, and avoid artificial deadlines and artificial meaning. Focus on building products that serve actual needs and launch MVPs that actually work, and then really incrementally improve them. And one thing I really want you to think about when you're thinking about developing digital products is what I call the marathon rule. In a marathon, it's really tough. I run these things. And one thing I've learned is that you're almost always doing better than you think, right? The Americans were actually doing a lot better than they thought they were doing, but they were paranoid about what the Soviet Union was doing. And they were actually doing really well, focusing on quality and moving forward. They did it with a unified effort, methodical approach. So my final point is that we can learn a lot from how NASA did things. I mean, let's think about it. They had super aggressive development deadlines still. They simultaneously had to create high quality stuff. That's something we're trying to do all day, every day. I mean, NASA put someone on the moon. It wasn't perfect. They moved fast. They had to invent along the way. They had to figure out solutions to new problems. But they did it with professional excellence, attention to safety, and good method. And in doing so, they beat a hyper-competitive, far less careful Soviet Union to the moon. It wasn't impossible at all. It was just extraordinary. And we can do this too in the digital products we do every day. All right, that's it. That's the Soviet space program. Again, I'm Dean. You can catch up with me online anytime you like. I'd love to talk about this a little bit more, and I appreciate you listening. I'm going to go ahead and close down my screen here. I think I'm really tight on time, so might not be able to get questions in.
That's fine. Thank you so much, Dean. I think we'll have time for maybe one or two questions. And thank you so much.
Okay.
That's incredibly insightful. It makes you wonder why we don't learn from history, because as you pointed out, all of these points have been proven in the past. And as you mentioned, it also goes back to Jay's talk about looking at your history and learning from that and really understanding why things have turned out the way they have. And we often don't pay enough attention to that. So thank you very much. I would definitely want to hear more about this. But first, do we have any questions? You can type in the questions in the chat or come up to the questions podium. I think, Dean, you maybe just explained everything very well already.
Well, I appreciate everyone listening very much. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you so much. And I look forward to chatting to you a bit later again.